So, welcome viewers, welcome to Frontline Conversations. My name is Vikhar Ahmed Sayeed, and I'm the Frontline correspondent in Bangalore. Today, I have a very special guest with me, Rollo Romig. Rollo Romig is an American journalist, essayist, and critic who works for Solutions Journalism Network and writes feature stories for the New York Times Magazine. I Am on the Hit List, A Journalist's Murder, and the Rise of Autocracy in India is his first book. That's the reason why we're chatting with him today. And the title is a tongue-in-cheek reference to Gauri's own version of the list of targets made by elements of the Hindu right wing in which she had included herself because she was aware of how much she had provoked the Hindu right through her journalistic output and activism. The book, which begins with the murder of Gauri Lankesh, which really shook the nation and the world in a way after her murder on September 5th, 2017. Rollo has sort of done extensive reportage and research, and the book is written in crisp and clear prose and will be valuable for a long time for carefully capturing the life and death, or rather sensitively capturing the life and the gruesome death of Gauri Lankesh and chronicling the investigation that followed. The book also encapsulates the troublesome trajectory of Indian politics and society after Narendra Modi became Prime Minister in 2014, because any quest to understand Gauri's life and her death cannot be done without understanding how the country has changed since 2014. Thank you, Rollo. Thank you for joining Frontline. I understand this is the first interview that you're giving to an Indian publication.
Thanks, Vikhar. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm really glad to be talking with you this morning.
But at what point did you decide that you wanted to write a book on the life and death of Gauri Lankesh?
Well, it's a good question. I'd been as you mentioned, I'd been spending a lot of time in India and particularly in Bangalore in the years preceding that time. And I'd been thinking for a while about writing a book about South India to try to capture just what I think is so extraordinary and special about the place. I hadn't really yet hit upon a specific subject, a specific focus for the book. And Gowrie's murder obviously came as an enormous shock. And it was partly a shock just because no one in Bangalore really seemed to have ever imagined that such a violent assassination would ever happen there. India, is no stranger to violence, unfortunately, just like my own country, the United States. Political violence is actually pretty routine in both countries. Just like in the US, there's a big variety of kind of how much gun violence you even see in different parts of the country. There are parts of India in the north that remind me a bit of Texas with how yeah, how common gun ownership is, even though there are very strict gun laws in India. Bangalore, nothing like that. You never even hear of gun crimes in Bangalore. I had one police officer tell me that sometimes an entire year goes by in Bangalore without a gun even being discharged, let alone used in a crime, which is extraordinary. I'm not sure if that's actually true. It sounds like a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it kind of captures the point that even the fact that a gun was used in a crime, that alone was shocking in Bangalore. And the fact that this assassination out of the blue of this journalist, this woman shot dead alone on her doorstep, defenseless. It just came as a huge shock because I think it really shook Bangaloreans' idea of their city, of what was even possible there, and of what the nature of the city was. I felt that too. And at the same time, I felt that, her murder opened up so many new questions, so many new mysteries. Who had done it? No one took credit for it. No one explained why it had happened. All people could do was guess why she was murdered. It was actually incredibly mysterious at first. And people had strong opinions about who might have done it, but no one knew for sure. And there were a lot of contradictory theories out there at first. Um, so who had done it? What was their motivation? All of this was unclear. And it seemed to me all at once that in this incredibly unfortunate story of Gauri Lankesh's assassination, uh, it encapsulated so many of the qualities and the questions that I was interested in pursuing in a book.
I want to ask you, I read the book very carefully and I was very impressed that you've built this life, this biography of Gauri, even without meeting her, right? You've sort of understood her personality and what is the sense that you built of Gauri Lankesh as a person, her work as a journalist, as an activist? Because for her, at some point in her career, journalism and activism were not distinct, right? She identified as a activist journalist. And if you could segue towards why she was killed, right?
Yeah, well, I'm grateful that you think that I captured Gauri accurately. It's it's a strange thing to write a book about someone who you've never met, and always wondering if you capture that person accurately, especially someone as complex as Gauri Lankesh, who, when she was murdered, as you said, there was this enormous outpouring in response to it. And there was kind of an additional mystery that came with that outpouring because the response was huge in part just because of the shock of the fact of it. But it was huge also because she had such an extraordinary variety of friends across the state, and they all came out. And I got the sense that until that moment of this mass demonstrations in response to Gauri's murder, a few people really understood how many different people she touched personally and how many different communities she was connected to, which is all the more extraordinary because her paper was actually quite small. Its reach was limited, and but yet she had this incredible coalition of people who she would, virtually every community in Bangalore and across the state that you could imagine, coming out and quite passionately mourning her death. And so even her own family members, said to me, we didn't realize that she'd actually touched so many people and that she knew so many people. And, she'd part of it is that, she was a person she was kind of known for being very, very noisy. She had a lot of opinion. She had a lot of outrage. She never hesitated to voice them. But at the same time, she was very quietly and without seeking credit, doing this slow, quiet work of building communities and just supporting people. And more than one person I spoke to told me about this, that, she, there were many defamation lawsuits slapped on her over the course of her career as a journalist. And partly because defamation suits are one of the primary ways that journalists are harassed. Unfortunately, Indian law makes it very easy to file a defamation suit against a journalist, and her people who were annoyed at her or disliked her would file suits against her all over the state, which required her to appear in court at, courtrooms top to bottom all over Karnataka. And she used that as an opportunity to explore all the best little food joints all over the state. And so she had this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of all the best little, regional food spots all over the state. That's the kind of person she was, that she was like, you know what, I have to go to court, but I'm not going to complain about it. I'm sure she complained some, but I'm going to turn this into an opportunity actually for fun, for connection, for community, and use it as a way to connect with people and to eat a lot of delicious food. Yeah.
What did you think of her journalism and her self-identification as an activist journalist?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. She was sometimes her approach to journalism really exasperated people who she knew well, people with kind of a more conventional approach to journalism. Her approach to journalism was not conventional. She didn't follow all the rules. It was partly an approach that she inherited from her father, P. Lankesh, who was as you know, a giant of Kannada literature and maybe most of all of Kannada journalism. He was adept in pretty much every form of writing that there is, short stories, plays, poems, but he really made his mark as the editor of the tabloid newspaper Lankesh Patrike, which it's hard for outsiders to Karnataka to really understand the full impact of this paper. It was an absolute phenomenon. It just had the most passionate readership that you could imagine of a publication. People just counting the hours until the next issue came out. And then the newsstand would just get wiped out of copies as soon as they arrived. That's how much people love this paper. And she ultimately took over this paper from his father after his death in the year 2000. And his approach was highly unconventional. He kind of made new rules for journalism and for newspapers in Karnataka. And in many ways, he kind of invented the Indian tabloid as we know it today. So it's this unusual mix of very high-minded kind of literary content, but also just low gossip on any subject, and just really relishing the gossip, which could get pretty lurid sometimes. And always in an idiom that could just reach readers wherever they were. So it was a publication that just appealed to people at every class, people of every community, and he invited and really encouraged and relished direct contributions from members of as many communities as possible in the paper. And he never took advertisements for the paper. This was one of the ways that he maintained his independence. Uh, and he also could be a little bit reckless with how he presented things. He never used, when he's writing about a crime, for example, he'd never use words like allegedly, which
And
most
Gauri
journalists.
followed this style.
Exactly. So all these things Gauri followed, and then added some of her own idiosyncrasies to her approach too. So yeah, Gauri would never, when reading about a crime, say so and so allegedly did, which you and I would of course always do if someone's not been convicted of a crime. We add these hedging words. Um, uh, uh, because there hasn't been a verdict yet. But she would never do this. She would say, we just have to call it like it is. We know this person did it. I'm just gonna say it. She would so this got her in trouble. This kind of opened her up to even more lawsuits. Actually, she was convicted, not long before she was murdered. She was convicted in a defamation lawsuit. She was sentenced to jail time, which she got deferred as she filed an appeal. But there's a chance that she might have actually served jail time had she lived. And
And for
so
her, there was no distinction between her journalism and activism.
Yeah, and that was an evolution for her. And that's an interesting thing about Gauri is that she changed a lot over the course of her life. People who knew her at different phases of her life sometimes sound like they're describing a different person. It certainly was the same person. She still had the same qualities warmth and humor and passion that at any stage of her life. But she was really for the long early phase of her career before she took over her father's paper, she really was a more conventional style of journalist. She was using the word allegedly, I'm sure, and she really thought that it was appropriate to keep journalism and activism distinct. And she believed in this principle of journalistic neutrality, and objectivity. She really came to reject that position over time as she took over her father's paper, started writing in Canada for the first time, and really became immersed in the ground realities of the state. Uh, she, there was something about that experience that really ignited a passion in her for local causes, and particularly the cause, as we mentioned earlier, of communal harmony. And she quickly realized, I have an agenda here. There is I believe in this cause. I want to fight for it. I want to say so outright in my paper, and I will. And it started a shift in her that she kept shifting over the years after that began. And first, after a while, she started calling herself a journalist activist. Then even that equation flipped. She started calling herself an activist journalist. And um, and she really came to reject this framework of the objective journalist, of the neutral journalist. Her attitude was, you know what? All of us have biases. We can pretend we don't have biases. Um, and but we have them. And she said, I'm through with apologizing for the fact that I have an agenda that I do want to promote. I think it's a good agenda. I believe in communal harmony. I think this is a good thing, and I shouldn't be ashamed to say it, just because I'm a journalist.
So, moving on to the procedural aspects of the investigation, if you
Yeah,
can briefly, I mean, I'm a journalist in Bangalore, I followed the case, but it was very useful even for me to see it delineated so clearly and coherently. So, if you can just briefly, starting from the murder, if you
yeah.
could just go over.
Yeah, certainly. Well, as I said, after she was murdered, it was no one knew who had done this or why. There were many theories all at once. Many people were suggesting, especially her friends and colleagues, that it was likely to have been an attack that came from some faction of the right wing. But no one even knew more specific than that. And even that was hotly debated. There were a lot of different, suspects and allegations thrown around in the months after her murder. As I said, she attracted a lot of complaints. Everyone who filed a defamation suit against her was immediately thought of as a suspect. Everyone who she'd had an argument or dispute with, and she argued constantly. She didn't hold grudges against people she argued with, but other people might have held grudges against her. And people speculated maybe it was a land dispute that was based on nothing, but in Bangalore, it's always a plausible possibility that a land dispute has something to do with a murder. And in a rebuttal to the allegation that the it might have been motivated by the right wing, uh, many from the right started suggesting very strongly that maybe she was murdered by Naxalites. Um, and were putting forth that theory very strongly. And there were many other theories besides. Uh, and for months, it just seemed that the investigation was making absolutely no headway at all. And most people close to Gauri started becoming pretty cynical about it, assuming that there would be no break in the case. Because here's the thing, her murder was the fourth murder in a pattern of murders, all of them writers. The first was Narendra Dabholkar, then there was Govind Pansare, then M.M. Kalburgi in Maharashtra and Karnataka. And the murders seemed to progressively move south with each murder, spread out sometimes by as long as a couple of years, but all with the same modus operandi, all shot with the same kind of gun by two men on a motorcycle. Nearly every detail about the approach matched, and even the kind of person targeted. An older writer with progressive ideas. And there was a huge special investigation team, a lot of fuss, a lot of media attention after Gauri's murder. It was such a high-profile case. At one point, hundreds of police officers were assigned to the case, to the special investigation team. And then it just kind of seemed to go quiet after a few months. And people assumed, well, this is just going to go the same way as the other cases. It turned out they were actually doing some pretty remarkable police work. And they were smartly keeping quiet about it, so as not to give away what they were finding. And in the early and mid months of 2018, they started arresting quite a few people for the conspiracy to kill Gauri, a number of whom seem to have been involved in, or were allegedly involved in these earlier murders too, of these three other men that I mentioned. And and they, this special investigation team, uh, they used a lot of really j just kind of they used every approach that you could imagine. Some of them highly technological, up to the minute, using machine learning to trace phone call patterns, using AI to track what they found in surveillance camera footage, using a DNA analysis. They found discarded toothbrushes, for example, left behind by some of the conspirators, and using a technique called gait analysis, because when the shooter killed Gauri, he appeared on a CCTV camera for just 6 seconds, a CCTV camera of Gauri's in front of her house. Grainy footage, 6 seconds, but you could see how the man walked, and they actually brought the lead suspect in the case um, to Gauri's house, had him walk on the same path, and then did a computer analysis comparing the style of walking from the video to the recreation. Um, they used an EDAX machine to find bullets that were embedded in trees where the suspects had allegedly done target practice, and then did ballistics to compare what they found in the trees to what they found in the scene of Kyrie's murder. So many different techniques, and then just kind of good old-fashioned shoe leather reporting, interrogation, everything that you can imagine, and seem to have really cracked the case, although it's still up in the air because 18 men have been charged, 17 have been arrested, one is still absconding. The trial began in the summer of 2022 and is still ongoing and could be going for quite a long time sooner. And meanwhile, even though the SIT did so much really impressive work in apparently cracking the case, there's now the feeling that the case is falling apart.
What can you tell us about the profiles of the accused, the 18
Yeah.
accused? Are all of them affiliated to the Sanatan Samstha slash Hindu Jana Jagrana Samiti?
Yes, most of them are connected to the Sanatan Samstha and its offshoot organizations. Um, and it's interesting, it does have multiple offshoot organizations, which the more I learned about the Sanatan Samstha, which is this kind of fringe, right-wing religious group, they have an ashram in Goa where they're headquartered. But yeah, they have all these kind of offshoot groups, which I think is honestly partially intended to confuse people who are trying to learn about them. But it's all Sanatan Samstha. And they've got this they're public-facing attitude is of this very high-minded, peaceful, spiritual community. People who live in Goa near their ashram often complain that they have the qualities of a cult, and that their members seem brainwashed, that they're actually highly hostile to even local Hindu traditions that contradict their very specifically defined idea of what Hinduism should be. Um, this very narrow idea of what they think is permissible even among Hindus, let alone other religious communities. And so yeah, it's interesting because Sanat Sansa is described as a fringe group, and I think it's an accurate description in a lot of ways. It's a relatively small group. They're very local. Their uh, attitudes are extreme. Um, they've, in many cases, endorsed and been accused of violence, including terrorist violence, setting bombs in public places to kill civilians. Um, or their members have. And but their political program, honestly, is in most ways indistinguishable from the political program of the ruling party of India, the BJP. So is that fringe? If they actually, and this is not coming from me, this is something that both BJP members and Sanatan Sansta members have said on the record that their political agendas are closely aligned. Most of the conspirators, yes, seem to have emerged from this group. The leaders of it, of this conspiracy to kill these four men, these various conspiracies, sorry, four men, three men and Gauri Lankesh, of course, um, often had close ties or even, relatively senior positions in the organization. All of them who had roles in Sanatan Sansa quit those roles before going underground and joining these murder conspiracies, which makes it difficult. It's made it difficult for the police to pin these crimes directly on Sanatan Sansta. And Sanatan Sansa as an organization has not been charged. Their guru has not been charged. He's actually a recluse. No one's really seen him for a couple of decades publicly. And although he wrote a book that was included in the charge sheet, that all of the members of the conspiracy read, that is really, you could describe this book as a manual for murder, actually. This book that the guru of Sanatan Sansta wrote. So he wrote this book, published this book. It was obviously kind of the key inspirational text for the conspirators, but somehow he's untouchable. Um, and that's another one of the ongoing mysteries of this case.
You access the charge sheet, which sort of gives you clarity that the reason Gauri was shot was because of one speech, one particular speech that she delivered in 2012 that was shown repeatedly to the accused in order to sort of rile them up in a way. So, can you discuss this particular video?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that it really did seem to come down in their minds to one speech that there was this understandable assumption among many who knew her that she'd been killed for something that she'd done in her journalism. She'd maybe been targeted because she was a journalist. In some levels that, all this may be true, but it was very interesting in reading the charge sheet how focused they were on this one speech. And this was true across the pattern um, of these writers who were assassinated, that in most of the cases, the killers seem to be really focused on specific things that the victims said, um, that they found to be unacceptable or even blasphemous against Hinduism. So in this particular case, Gauri had said it was a speech that she gave in front of a large audience. She'd said, and I'm paraphrasing here, something to the effect that Hinduism is a religion that has no mother and father. And she said it in kind of a mocking way, and in comparison to other major world religions. And she did honestly have this way of sometimes speaking in a mocking way about religion. She had mixed feelings about religion. She wasn't a religious believer herself, and she didn't really understand religious belief by her own admission. Uh, at the same time, I think she had a lot more respect for religion, including Hinduism, than her detractors often understand. She loved to celebrate religious holidays with her niece and nephew, uh, um, and explain to them the significance of traditions, Hindu, Muslim, Christian. and so on. It seems that the killers really fixated on what she said in this speech. As you said, they showed it to each other as a way, repeatedly, as a way to sort of get themselves riled up for the idea of killing her. And this idea that, what she said was blasphemous and cannot be tolerated. And this is something we increasingly hear in the uh, in popular talk or political talk about religion in India. This idea of blasphemy, that we need blasphemy laws and that religions need to be protected from what people say. There is no concept of blasphemy in the Hindu scriptures.
So, Rollo, this is going to be my last question. It's been an insightful conversation, a more personal question, slightly discomforting perhaps. But at one point in your book, while commenting on the tactics of the Indian government to silence its critics, you write, foreign journalists and academics who have commented critically on the government are routinely sent back when arriving at Indian airports. I felt the chilling effect of this tactic. I wondered if I'd ever be allowed to visit my in-laws in India again after the publication of this book. And if not, was it worth it? Do you think it was worth writing this book?
Certainly. I just one thing I've really learned from Gauri is that you can't even second guess these things. You have to write what needs to be written. And there was actually a quote of hers that circulated quite a bit after she was killed. Probably the quote of hers that circulated more than any other. I saw it actually pop up organically quite a bit on social media during the protests against the citizenship laws back in 2020. And she said, I will do what I can and I will say what I should. These intolerant voices find strength in our silence. Let them learn to argue using words instead of threats. That's the quote. And uh I'm not someone who's actually used to speaking in an opinionated way on public platforms. It makes me uncomfortable, frankly. But, uh that's I feel you can't be immersed in the life of Gauri Lankesh as I've had the privilege of being over these past few years and not take that lesson to heart. Uh, that you will say what you should, and the consequences are always unpredictable, and you have to just face them.
Rollo, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for speaking to Frontline.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it too.